Now we're going to cover some more advanced tools or stuff you can kind of gradually get into as you develop your beekeeping hobby or business. These are things that are going to help with survival at different points in the season and kind of make you be able to respond to different situations you see in your hive and not feel helpless maybe in those moments. The first one we're going to talk about is hive spacers. So the Langstroth hive operates on a principle of giving bees the space they need to move between the frames, one passing the other, and build out the wax to a certain depth. I just call it bee space.
Yeah.
So if you're either working with an 8 frame or a 10 frame, these tools are going to help align your frames kind of exactly for that space. Sometimes when you're putting them in and you're moving really fast, you end up pushing a bunch to one side. And throughout the season, then those frames will be not as wide as they need to be when it comes to how deep they build the wax out. And then the other frames on our side will have a really deep wax to them. And when you're harvesting honey, that makes it really hard to deal with those differences. So you use these tools to just go in here and gradually space out each one of your frames so it fits within its allotted space in the hive. I forget to use this a ton, but especially when it comes time to put on my honey super and for stuff I'm going to be harvesting honey from, I like to try and use this just to speed up and make the honey harvest more efficient and waste less honey in that. Another thing that you can harvest from hives is pollen. So bees make and collect pollen and store it in their hives, packing it into cells just like they do honey. It's really cool to see that in a hive, and we have that for you to look at, looking at the pollen packed into a cell. But harvesting that from those cells is really difficult, would be really invasive, and it wouldn't be like a clean, refined pollen. It would have wax and nectar mixed in with it. So this pollen harvester goes on the front of the hive and is something the bees have to pass through to get into the hive itself. They essentially are going through these tiny metal slats in here, and as they do that, the way bees carry pollen is kind of packed on their abdomen, on their rear legs, and so as they come through here, that pollen falls off and then is collected in this trap that is on the bottom. You're only supposed to put this on the hive maybe for 1 or 2 days at the height of a specific pollen that you may be wanting to get, because it's so invasive. We talked about the queen excluder and how that can shorten bees' lifespan moving through that tight, narrow space, and that's just even more so with this. Bee pollen is a kind of unique product, and if it's something you're looking to get into, there's a couple different designs for pollen capture. Next, we're going to talk about insulative kind of frames or additions you can add to your hive. Shannon had mentioned the wrap that can go around the hive, and while that can kind of protect against winds and keep heat in, we also want to protect the top, and we also want to draw moisture out of the hive itself. For insulative, we can just take a foam board. This is like a foam board you could buy at Home Depot, and we built a frame that it goes in. This would be something I would put on top of my hive in winter and have it sealed up if I was really worried about cold temperatures. But again, this wouldn't do a lot for humidity, and actually a wrap with this on top would make that hive a lot more humid in the winter. And so one thing we like to try and do is make a similar thing, but fill it with something that's going to draw the moisture out of the hive. So this is just a basic cloth that's been stapled in to this box. And inside we're putting a really dry wicking type of material. So this is a dry cedar chip mulch You could probably use a lot of different stuff. We like cedar because it's already has properties which help ward off other insects. But it's going to insulate, it's going to help trap heat, but it's going to help draw out moisture. And so maybe if you get this on your hive in the beginning of winter, during warm spells or when the temperature's up above freezing, upper 40s, maybe near 50, you can go in and actually come and feel the heat and feel the moisture in this. And we'll even replace some material in winter if it's gotten really wet, absorbing all that kind of warm, humid air from the hive that's rising up. So those are two ways you can help kind of deal with temperature and moisture in your hive as you're working through it. And now maybe we're going to talk about ways you can help kind of supplement the bees at different points in the season as well. The first thing we have is this candy box. It is designed as a way to feed bees either with pollen or with sugar water. It's designed again to go right on top, and you can see there's a small slat here. See my face between? So bees, when they're lower in the hive, can come up through that and come into either one of these watertight boxes. They've been sealed with a silicone caulk. And in there you can either put pollen patties, which are essentially a kind of harder, tackier mixture of pollen and wax and propolis, or you can put a more liquidy honey syrup, sugar syrup. With those, you want to be careful you're not creating a swimming pool that bees are just going to drown in. So you always have some sort of slat that is going to cover it and kind of be at the level of the liquid that you have in there, so the bees can land and slurp up the honey if they need to. This is something, you think about feeding bees and supplementing their feed at times where they are vulnerable, or that nature is not really providing them what they need to survive or replenish their stores. So that's usually at times when you're introducing a new hive, at times of really poor weather when your hive is vulnerable or being requeened or stuff like that, and kind of in the very late winter, early spring, when the bees are starting to ramp up the amount of eggs they're laying. They're ramping up their numbers from their low winter population, but you might not see kind of the outdoor spring activity that you would think would be synonymous with that. Bees kind of live on this threshold where they want to have enough workers to take advantage of pollen and nectar when it starts to flow, but sometimes can overcompensate, especially the Italian bees that you can get are known for building up their numbers too fast and ending up in this really early spring conundrum where they don't have the food to support all the bees in the hive. So those are times that you could think of adding a syrup to help with that hard moment.
And the ideal winter food for bees is, of course, honey, but sometimes, so you want to leave them as much honey as you can in their hive, depending on how much you're harvesting. Usually you leave one big box full of honey, but like Tyler said, sometimes that runs out towards the end of the winter. So the other sort of feeding things we have, this is a little feeder. This is this one looks like it uses a small mouth jar, but you'd fill it up with the syrup, the sugar and water, and you'd screw it on and then tuck this into your entrance, and it would come out here and the bees would come lap it up, and there's little like islands for them to hang out on so they don't drown in there. This is a feeder that you would stick on top of your hive, like over here. And then your jar would fit down in there, and this has little holes in it so the bees can come and lap it up there. And then you'd have another box around the outside.
And
this,
go ahead.
Oh, this is a custom one that Tyler made for the top bar hive. So you can also get creative and make your own. They don't need to be complicated at all. You just want to make sure the bees have access to it, they aren't going to drown, and that you can add syrup without opening the hive all up, because if you need to go in there, it's super late winter, early spring, it's cold outside, you don't want to be taking apart the hive to put food in there, because you will cause more damage than you will help.
Which is why most of these are that kind of like take off the roof, put them on and put the roof back on, and not going down
super
in there.
fast and non-invasive.
And the ratio I usually use is 1-to-1 sugar to water for my syrup. I don't know if there are other ratios, but it doesn't have to, you don't want it too watery because you don't want it to just leak out of your jar, but you also want it to kind of flow and not crystallize. So making sure it's totally dissolved, maybe using heat, then cooling it down before you put it in your jar and putting it on top.
Yeah, the same consistency, maybe a little more liquidy than honey is, or warm honey.
Yeah.
Cool, so those are feeding options. There are probably other types too, and like Tyler said, the patties, they're solid and liquid versions. This is a little queen catcher. It's also an extremely cheap little thing that's handy to have if you are, as you progress in your beekeeping, if you're wanting to get in and have a good look at the queen, make sure she's in there, you find her, you can grab her, and this is a safe little place to keep her while you examine her, or maybe you're really taking your hive apart a lot and you're afraid of her getting out and crawling away, so you can kind of keep her safe in there. Just a nice, easy little tool. This is foundation, and this is a plastic foundation. There's also wax foundation, or it's plastic and then it'll have a wax coating on it. Foundation is what you put inside. Do you have any empty frames?
Nope.
You put inside of a frame. So this is one for like a honey super, and it's a guide for the bees. So it's saying work off of this. They build off of this size. Oh yeah, there's one right there. These can be really great in keeping your frames more uniform. Sometimes you can also have no foundation at all, which can be really cool. If you don't care about having a bunch of production, you're kind of just doing it as an educational thing or experimental, not having foundation in there is fine. They'll just be sometimes a little more creative with the shape, the waviness of their comb that they build. So this is to give them that little roadmap. Yeah, and it's important that if you get these used, especially with the wax on them, you need to know where they're coming from, because these can hold disease and things in them too.